Welcome to Public Conference, the Milwaukee Public Library's weekly community affairs series. Our program today is called Black Vets and the Legacy of Vietnam. Our special guest is Wallace Terry, author of the widely acclaimed book, Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans. Award-winning Public Conference is presented weekly by your Milwaukee Public Library. Our guests all have concerns about the Vietnam veteran and how America has treated him. Let's meet them. Wallace Terry, the author of Bloods, was a correspondent for Time magazine in Vietnam. Now living in Washington, D.C., he has appeared as a commentator on numerous TV shows and has produced his own TV series as well as films. William Sims, a much-decorated combat veteran of Vietnam, has been active in Veterans Affairs. And Tom Wynn is executive director of the National Association for Black Veterans. Our moderator for today's public conference program is Michael Kinney, librarian in charge of the Llewellyn Library at 907 East Russell Avenue in Bayview. America seems to be going through the struggle of looking hard at Vietnam and what that war did to this country. Books, television, movies, magazines all have contributed to this probing examination a decade after the war. But what about the black veteran? Has his particular role, his particular contribution, and his particular problem been recognized by the entire population? Here to begin our discussion on the black Vietnam vet is our moderator, Michael Kinney. Mike?
Thank you, and good morning. Wallace Terry, your new book, Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans, has been hailed as one of the best books ever written on Vietnam. Could you tell us something about the title, Bloods, the significance of it?
Thank you, Michael. Bloods is a sort of a shorthand term which black soldiers had for themselves in Vietnam. I guess its origins lies in the ghetto expression, blood brothers. And it conjures up a feeling of togetherness. We are all here and we have to deal with a lot of burdens that other soldiers in the Vietnam theater did not have to deal with. It's my contention that the black soldier had a very unique experience in Vietnam because he not only went through everything which all the white soldiers had to go through, but he had these special burdens. Among them is the fact that blacks accounted for up to 23% of the dying of American casualties in the first 2 years of the war. Even at the war's peak in much later years, when the draftees began to filter in, blacks were still about 18% of those who were being killed. Additionally, blacks were defending a nation that was not treating them as well as the white soldier was being treated. And they would also return home to a nation who had lost the great promise that they were giving to black people. The great society was beginning to fade and benign neglect under Richard Nixon was taking over. Blacks were also, Michael, the object of a special communist propaganda campaign aimed at dividing black and white soldier, suggesting to the black soldier, this is not your war, it's back home in America. Lay your guns down. Do not fight against another people of color. And then finally, blacks encountered discrimination off the battlefields in Vietnam, where they had to experience cross burnings, see the sight of Confederate flags, even at the news of the death of Martin Luther King. And they also found that they were slow in getting promotions and getting awards for similar acts of valor and in getting coveted rear area assignments, which would get them out of the line of fire. And then finally, when black soldiers came home, just as white soldiers, they found the doors shut in their face by an America which was uncaring, an America which said from the far right, you're the first Americans to lose a war, and from the far left, you are baby killers, you're responsible for massacres like My Lai, and tried to blame the war on the soldiers who never started it and did not want to be there in the first place. And finally, the same black veteran, just like the white veteran, had to deal with this inhospitable way that we treated all of our veterans, inducing what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But on top of it, the black soldier was told, you were the flunky of the white man for going there in the first place. You were duped by white America. So there was a further burden if you were a black veteran.
That sounds like a difficult situation, both in Vietnam and back home. William, can you tell us something about your experience? Did you find it difficult to talk about Vietnam when you returned home?
Well, I did in a sense of where only to people that were very close to me, family and very few friends that had some military experience previously, that I could openly discuss some of the hostility that I had at that particular time. In doing that, I found that there was a number of guys that I ran into that were Vietnam vets that had very similar problems also.
Bill, how old were you when you went to Vietnam?
I was 22 years old,
22 years old
when I went to Vietnam.
You were an old soldier.
Yes, I was drafted, as a matter of fact. When you mentioned later on the guys got drafted, that was one of my things, too.
Because the average soldier to fight in Vietnam was only 19 years old, Michael,
Right.
as opposed to World War II when the average age was 26. And that suggests a more traumatic experience in Vietnam because of your age. Just that tender age alone made the experience much more painful of encountering the suddenness of seeing your buddies die or being in a situation where you have to take life. Whereas the average age is 26 in World War II, we'll say, here you have a man who's probably has started a family. He's worked a couple of jobs. His education has been completed. And then, too, in World War II, you went with a unit, you came back with a unit after the war was won. In Vietnam, you came home one at a time.
Yes, very much so. And as a matter of fact, when you did find yourself alone in coming back, the only camaraderie you could muster up was with people that you knew that was in the service together. So those type of difficulties that Wallace is talking about, they were rampant in '65 also.
Sure.
Yes.
Wallace mentioned a lot of things, and one of them was race relations and racial tension. Did you find that to be, how did you find race relations in Vietnam when you were there?
Ironically, the first 3 guys that got wounded in my unit were whites that when we were on patrol, sporadic fire happened, and it's just those 3 individuals that got hit. It made you a little leery of what was happening in Vietnam, and then when we did get back to base camp, we did have certain frictions, but at that time it was so much to be done in terms of cleaning and clearing land and things. Initially when I was over there, it was more so a burden to have a safe place of security when you're back in base camp than anything else. So it was a lot of work off and on.
Tom, the National Association for Black Veterans is campaigning for amnesty for many of the black veterans who, in Vietnam, who received less than honorable discharges.
Yes.
Could you give some background on that effort?
Well, the effort began through the efforts of William Sims and 6 or 7 other returning Vietnam-era veterans who came back to Milwaukee. When we began to, and I, of course, I'm not a Vietnam veteran, I'm a Korean-era veteran, but I became interested in the problems of Vietnam veterans. Mm-hmm. And when we began to investigate the problems of black veterans particularly, we found that 1 out of 3 blacks that was getting out of the military had a less than honorable discharge. We found that 80% of all the guys that were being incarcerated while in the military were black. We found, just as Wallace Terry has mentioned, that disproportionately, blacks were dying and being wounded on the front lines. And the other thing is that Vietnam veteran was so very young. So when he left home, he had no particular skills. They were duped into the military in many instances. They volunteered for the military because there was no place else for them to go. They were on the street corners with no skills, no jobs. Went into the military, didn't test well, so therefore they received assignments that would not allow them any form of upward mobility. And so the whole thing about the military lost all of its luster. And in addition to that, the racism. Racism is so blatant in the military, you can cut it with a knife. You can imagine a situation where there's no justice at all, because if you're dealing with justice on the military justice system, that is not under constraints of the Constitution of the United States. And you know how bad it is for blacks to get justice outside dealing with the Constitution. You know what it would be like for them dealing without the Constitution. And so all kinds of barriers were placed in the Vietnam veterans' way, and so we had to work to try to remove those barriers and to train ourselves in order to help ourselves. And so we began initially here in Wisconsin, we started the outreach concept and bringing veterans into community-based organizations because veterans did not want to affiliate with the bureaucracy at all.
Right. What kind of problems are the veterans having?
Oh, the problem stretched from post-traumatic stress disorders. We didn't know they were post-traumatic stress disorders in 1969, but we knew it was something. Right. And we were, we were treating, the veterans were treating themselves. The other non-honorable discharges, we have made some gains in that area, but not enough. We do believe that there should be one type discharge. We feel that, particularly since discharges were given out administratively, that is without court, without due process, that these young men who did go and serve this country should have an opportunity for amnesty if we have given amnesty to people who did not and refused to serve. And only about a third of the young men in this country that were eligible for the draft or eligible to serve in the military did go into the military. And so we feel that those guys that did go, if they were had some problems, and in many instances, I want you to know that they served on the front line. Some of them served with valor, some of them were injured, some of them had served 1 and 2 terms in Vietnam, and most of the times their problems came when they weren't on the line, but when they were behind the lines and when they came back to the States.
Right. Then you also recall, Tom, that 100,000, McNamara 100,000 that got some of the youth off the street, in the sense of it escalated to over 400,000 or 500,000, I believe it was.
Right after the Tet Offensive.
Right.
And it went all the way up to 300,000 people. And so there again, this is what happened in America at that time, was that they'd opened the floodgates for people who were considered to be unfit and undesirable to begin with, and then turned around and gave them discharges that said they were unfit and unsuitable for military service, which of course is a sham.
Right.
Project 100,000 was, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, what it was?
Well, that initiated sometime in the latter part of the 60s, I believe it was in the time, where McNamara issued some order in regards to the drafting of youth, in the sense of, well, I was imagining...
Well, the whole purpose was really, Michael, to lower the standards.
Right.
In other words, a youngster who perhaps would have been turned aside by the Selective Service Board because they don't have the certain basic skills that are required to make you a dependable soldier. So they just lowered the standards and brought all these young people in. And the sad thing about all of this is, as Tom has said, is that you are not training them or preparing them for a return to a constructive place in our society. And it was an uncaring situation. They could have done this. They could have given these young men verbal skills and other kinds of skills so that they could have taken on other jobs, perhaps, and stayed in the service, or come out better equipped to deal outside of the system. But you see, many of them got into some difficulty in the service, largely because, I think, of their own militancy or their inability to accept racist behavior. You know, it's very interesting. In the first 2 or 3 years of the war, there was very little racial trouble. And that's because the war was being fought by professionals, careerists. Many of them who were black were there because they wanted to be there. It represented a better opportunity than you could find in American society. After all, in late 50s, early 60s, we had a very segregated society, especially in the South. In the middle period of the war, when a lot of the racial stress and troubles and tensions began to surface, it was a reflection upon the kind of young blacks who were coming into the service, swept in by the draft or McNamara's Project 100,000. And they were saying, in effect, when I see that Confederate flag, I'm not going to take it. And you can tell me this is okay for the good old boys. And since they're 10,000 miles away from home, that's fine. But it's not fine with me because I didn't want to be here. I don't want to be fighting these people. They never did anything to me, but I'll certainly take my chances here rather than go to jail, which was the alternative for black people. White people who had the resources could go off to Canada or go off to Sweden or could get a deferment and stay inside a college someplace until the war was over. We know that fewer than 12 graduates of Ivy League schools perished in Vietnam. But one black high school in Philadelphia, Thomas Edison High School, lost 54. And that gives you some indication of who fought this war. And it was not only minorities, poor minorities, but working class white people. That's who carried the burden of Vietnam, and that's who will carry the burden of future wars, unless we have a universal conscription and we take everybody in. And that's the only way there will be fair play in that sense. But mind you, Vietnam is not a one-dimensional story in terms of race relations. We know that the armed forces represents our society in microcosm. I don't care what color the uniform is. They like to tell you in the Marine Corps, there's only one color, Marine Corps green. But if you're black and you've been in there long enough, you know that they're dark green Marines and light green Marines, okay? But on the other side of it, when you get in the front lines, where you have to depend upon each other to survive, you discover right away that there are no atheists. When you hear that bomb falling or that rocket coming in, the first word out of somebody's mouth is, "Oh God." And listen, there are no racists on the front lines either, because you don't care what color that guy is who's out there to save your life or to help you lay the fire down to protect you. The sad thing is, those kinds of stories were never told when the men came home. And the great closeness that they felt, black and white, for each other on the front lines, not the rear area nonsense, when they were fighting and arguing over the music, whether it's going to be hillbilly or James Brown soul music or whatever. But that great camaraderie disappeared for two basic reasons. America said, we don't want to hear about Vietnam, especially from our veterans. Put that story in the closet, bury it. And secondly, blacks and whites, because of that, just separated and went in different directions. And they buried those kinds of relationships. I'm watching in Washington blacks and whites showing up at the memorial there, which we call the wall. And I see on occasions a white guy go up to a black guy and say, "I don't know you, but I had black buddies in Vietnam who went out on patrol with me. And they were the first black people that I really knew up close. And I came to love this black guy." Bloods is replete with stories of blacks saving whites, whites saving blacks. If we ever listened to our veterans, we could move race relations ahead in this country by 100 years, just emulating what they did in this terrible tragedy we call Vietnam. There is something positive that comes out of that racial story, just as there's a lot positive to be said for Vietnam veterans who have pulled themselves together, often without any other help except each other, and have made a stake for themselves and a new future for themselves. Almost always, the veterans who have come home from all of our wars, black and white, have provided a reservoir of talent which we should capitalize on because of the kind of leadership that war develops, because you're really on the edge like you can't be anywhere else in your life.
That's true. That's very eloquently spoken. Do you find that to be the case, or what could we be doing for black veterans?
Well,
or veterans in general?
Well, let's cite the problems. The problems are that, as a result, as I said before, of the less than honorable discharges, just use that as an example. We had, well, 55% of all the blacks that went into the military had less than a high school education, okay? So they fit the profile of the potential criminal in that they came from broken homes, they had no particular skills, they were uneducated, they went into the military and got an additional yoke around their neck, and that being the less than honorable discharge. So when you come home, you have nothing to, you can't go to school because you have no benefits, okay? You can't get a job because you have no skills. And so what it does in our community is it continues that poverty cycle that our young people stay into. I imagine the best thing that veterans can do for themselves is what we have attempted to do, and that is to get all the things from the federal government we can get from the federal government, and yet to organize and to try to get all the things for ourselves we can get for ourselves without the government. In other words, we do not disallow any veteran the opportunity to belong to our organization because of the type of discharge. Right. We feel that he's been discriminated enough against already, and we shouldn't further discriminate against that veteran. Now, we can't deal with the VA. We can try to advocate for him through the VA and through other bureaucracies. But on the other hand, we can advocate for him as an individual and as a citizen of the United States, and he can find that kind of assuring situation by working and joining and working with veterans and helping themselves.
And to add to that, that type of understanding and camaraderie to initially bring some information to make these guys feel that they haven't really lost anything, that they have contributed to a legacy that maybe have brought them out of a darkness, so to speak, into a new moral issue of things to come.
Which is what we call dealing with the lessons and the legacy of the Vietnam War.
Right. Did you make good friends? Were you close to people in Vietnam and people that you depended on?
I did. I was somewhat older, and I felt like, you know, these could have been some younger nephews of mine or relatives. And I took it upon myself to, you know, as being the old man, somewhat of a little unit, to give them the type of learning lessons that I thought that they could survive by, plus some types of spiritual understanding of what's happening to them.
Sims doesn't talk much about it, but he's much decorated, and he was a point man for a very long time in Vietnam. And
why don't you explain what a point man is, or someone should?
Well, someone that really leads the group to a particular destination, but they're generally out in front of the main body, maybe from 50 yards to maybe 200 to 300 yards. So you're the first one to really come in contact with the enemy. So it's a very vital spot. You can lead your own individuals into a trap, or they can just take you.
So it's one of the 200 yards in front of everybody else.
Correct.
Going at nighttime.
It depends on, I guess, the mission and then how far you're going. But
Bill should also add that he's supposed to make sure that they don't hit any booby traps.
Correct.
Or landmines along the way. That's what makes it so highly dangerous.
Yeah. You're supposed to be somewhat the pathfinder in terms of making sure the group gets to its destination. And that's quite a
I understand point men were disproportionately black in Vietnam.
I think
well, you're looking at me for
at the time that I was there, Tom, the point men were mostly black, but I'm saying at the time too, in my unit, I had it was more than 75% of the guys were black. So.
Well, see, Bill represents that period, that early period, where blacks were up to 34% of what we call the elite units. These are the rifle units in Airborne and Marine Corps, and what we call the better infantry divisions, such as the 1st Division. So that was true. A good third of those units were black. That number began to fade a little bit and reduce a little bit as the war expanded and the professionals began to go back home and be replaced more and more by drafted men.
Right, right. One thing that you mentioned earlier was about propaganda used against black soldiers, specifically in Vietnam.
Well, leaflets, the foghorn type effect, that type of thing of getting you as you walk through a village with leaflets scattered all around, telling you that you have a fight more so at home than here. This is somewhat of a family squabble, those type of things, to make you somewhat aware that you weren't really wanted in this particular situation. So again, you know, you had to try to deal with who was the enemy, who is the enemy, you know, where are the enemies.
But the incredible thing, Michael, about the black soldier, universally, generally, is that despite this kind of propaganda campaign by the communists, saying, in effect, this is not your war, you don't belong here, despite the terrible things that were happening to black people back in America, most notably the murder of Martin Luther King and of other leaders that black people respected and had great faith in, such as the late Senator Robert Kennedy, and despite having to face Confederate flags and all the rest of this on the battlefield, the black soldier remained tremendously loyal and extremely effective in combat. And I think of one character in the book, Bloods, Colonel Fred Cherry. Fred Cherry and Tom Wynn went to school together at Virginia Union, right? And they're both from Virginia. And when Fred Cherry was shot down, he was badly wounded, and he was captured by the North Vietnamese and thrown into prison for 7.5 years. And at one point, they put him in a cell with a white Southerner, expecting the two of them to really go at each other tooth and nail. And it was really curious because Fred didn't trust the white guy, Porter Halliburton, who was from Tennessee, incidentally, because he thought he might be a French spy. And Porter didn't trust Fred because he'd never heard of a black pilot, which gives you some idea how far we've come since then, because now we've had a 4-star black general, the late Daniel Chappie James, who did fly in Vietnam as well. But they tortured Fred Cherry for hundreds of days. And Fred always told them this: I will not do anything to let down 23 million black people back home. I will not dishonor my flag. There is nothing that the communists can do in America about our condition. That's for us to deal with when we get back home. And finally, despite any of America's flaws, America still remains the black man's best hope. And this was being said while the communists tortured him. And they wanted to break him because he was a senior black officer. And they wanted him to get on the radio and tell black soldiers to put their guns down. And I think he speaks for all black soldiers who fought in Vietnam. It's that kind of fierce patriotism and loyalty that surfaced despite all the problems.
That's very eloquently spoken. I thank you all very much for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having
All
us.
right. Here's Don with some books and magazine articles that are available at our library.
How often do you see Fred?
Thank you, Mike. These are the titles of some of the many books on Vietnam and veterans that are available in the library. Fire in the Lake, The Vietnamese and the Americans in Vietnam by Francis Fitzgerald. Charlie Company, What Vietnam Did to Us by Peter Goldman and Tony Fuller. Dispatches by Michael Hare. Vietnam, A History by Stanley Carnell. Long Time Passing, Vietnam and the Haunted Generation by Myra McPherson. And Bloods, An Oral History of the Vietnam War by Black Veterans by our guest, Wallace Terry. Magazine articles of interest include these: Black Vietnam Vets, No Peace Yet in the December 1981 Essence. Black Veterans, A New War, an article about our guest Wallace Terry and his book Bloods in the October 15, 1984 issue of Newsweek. The Legacy of Vietnam, a cover story and special issue of Newsweek, April 15th of this year. Vietnam Vets, How Well Did They Adjust? In the April 28, 1984 Science News, and Vietnam's Sad Legacy in the March 12, 1984 U.S. News and World Report. This reading list will be found in the April 22nd issue of the Milwaukee Reader, the library's weekly newsletter. Copies are free at your library or may be ordered by mail for only $3 per year. Our thanks to today's guests. Wallace Terry, a prize-winning journalist, is the author of Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans. William Sims of Milwaukee is a combat veteran of the Vietnam War. And Tom Wynn is the executive director of the National Association for Black Veterans, headquartered here in Milwaukee. Our moderator for today's public conference program has been Michael Kinney, head of the Llewellyn Neighborhood Library. Public conference is telecast here on TV6 each Sunday at 11 a.m. and repeated the following Saturday morning at 6 a.m. Next week, we will take a look at the amazing changes that are occurring in dentistry on a program called The New Look in Dentistry. Incidentally, Wallace Terry was in Milwaukee as the speaker at the literary luncheon for the Delta Memorial Endowment Fund of the Milwaukee Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. If you have comments on today's public conference program, please write to Public Conference in care of the Milwaukee Public Library at 814 West Wisconsin Avenue, or telephone the Publications and Exhibits Office during regular hours. 278-3031 is the phone number here in Milwaukee. This is Don Metzger speaking.